Some places of worship hide secrets that should never see daylight. These 4 true stories will make you understand why. What you're about to read comes from people who walked into churches seeking shelter and found something that shouldn't exist. Lock your doors. Turn on every light, because after this you'll never look at a steeple the same way again. Story 1. The Congregation That Wouldn't Speak. After graduating high school, my best friend Marcus had to relocate to a small town in rural Pennsylvania when his father got transferred for work. It was one of those forgotten places you pass through on the highway without ever really seeing. Just old buildings, empty storefronts, and woods that seemed to swallow everything at the edges of town. A few months after he moved, my other friend Derek and I decided to visit for a long weekend. Marcus seemed excited to show us around, though he admitted there wasn't much to see. "It's different here," he said on the phone, and something in his voice made me uneasy. "You'll understand when you get here." We arrived on a Friday evening and the town felt suffocating from the moment we drove in. The streets were too quiet, the houses too dark, and the few people we saw didn't wave or acknowledge us. They just stared until we passed. On Saturday, bored and restless, we decided to explore the dense forest that bordered the town. Marcus mentioned there was a creek that supposedly had great fishing spots, so we packed some sandwiches and headed out around noon. The forest was beautiful at first. Tall pines, dappled sunlight, the sound of water in the distance. We followed the creek for hours, talking and laughing like old times. But then we realized we'd lost track of our path. The sun was lower than we'd thought, casting long shadows through the trees. We tried retracing our steps, but everything looked the same. The creek bent and twisted, and we couldn't remember if we'd been following it upstream or down. Worst of all, there were no sounds of civilization, no distant cars, no voices, nothing but the water and the wind. We kept walking, trying not to panic, when Derek suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. Through a break in the trees, we could see a building. It was a church, but not like any church I'd ever seen. The structure was ancient, made of weathered red brick that looked like it had been standing there for centuries. The bricks were covered in moss and vines, and the small parking lot in front was nothing but hard-packed dirt with weeds growing through it. A rutted dirt road led away from the building, disappearing into the woods. "Thank God," Marcus breathed. "We can use their phone." As we got closer, we noticed 4 old cars parked in a neat row. They were all white sedans, or had been once. Now they were rust-eaten hulks from the 70s or 80s with flat or missing tires, dirt caked on every surface. They looked like they hadn't moved in decades. "Who drives cars like that?" Derek whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. Gospel music, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside the church. And voices, singing, though the melody sounded wrong somehow, like the notes were just slightly off-key. "People are here," I said, relief flooding through me. "Come on." We approached the heavy wooden doors at the front of the church. Up close, the building looked even more decrepit. Peeling paint, cracked windows, sections of the roof sagging. But the music continued, and that meant people, and people meant help. Marcus pulled open the door and we stepped into a small vestibule. The singing was louder now, echoing from the main hall. We could see light flickering, candles maybe, or old light fixtures. We pushed through the inner doors and looked inside. The church was full. I counted at least 30 people, maybe more, all dressed in their Sunday best, or what passed for it. The clothes were old-fashioned, like something from a thrift store, but clean and carefully pressed. Most of the congregation appeared poor, their faces weathered and worn. They sat in the wooden pews, all holding song sheets, all singing the same discordant hymn. At the front, an elderly woman with white hair and thick horn-rimmed glasses sat at an upright piano, her gnarled fingers moving over the keys. The moment we entered, her hand stopped. The music died instantly and the singing stopped mid-word. Then, slowly, so slowly it seemed choreographed, the old woman turned her head to look at us. Her face was completely expressionless, like a mask carved from wax. One by one, every person in that church stopped looking at their song sheets. They lowered them in perfect unison. Then, as if controlled by the same invisible string, they all turned their heads toward us. The silence was absolute. 30 pairs of eyes stared at us with the same vacant, hollow expression. Not angry, not curious, not afraid, just empty. Like they were looking at us but not seeing us, or seeing something about us that we couldn't understand. Their faces showed no emotion, no life. Just an infinite blankness that made my skin crawl. The only sound was the creaking of the old wooden pews under their weight. We're sorry to interrupt, Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. We got lost in the woods. We just need to use your phone to call my parents. They can come pick us up. No one responded. No one blinked. They just kept staring with those dead, vacant eyes. Please, Derek added quietly. We just need help. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong here. This wasn't just an unfriendly congregation. This was something else entirely. We should go, I whispered. Without waiting for an answer, we slowly backed toward the door. The eyes followed us. 30 heads moving in sync like a field of sunflowers tracking the sun. No one spoke. No one moved from their seats. They just watched us retreat with that terrible empty stare. We let the door swing shut behind us and stood in the parking lot, breathing hard. What the hell was that? Derek said, his voice shaking. I don't know, but we need to follow that road, Marcus said, pointing to the dirt path leading away from the church. It has to lead somewhere. We started walking quickly up the road, trying to put distance between us and that horrible building. That's when Derek noticed it. Guys, he said, his voice tight with fear. There were no crosses in there. We stopped and turned around. Derek was right. We'd been inside a church, but there had been no crucifix at the altar. No crosses on the walls, no religious iconography of any kind. Just bare walls and that piano and those people. And as we stood there staring back down the road, the front door of the church opened. Men started filing out, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They walked out slowly and assembled in a line in front of the building, all facing our direction, all watching us. Run, Marcus said. We ran. We sprinted up that dirt road as fast as our legs could carry us, branches whipping at our faces, our lungs burning. We didn't look back. We just ran and ran, convinced we'd hear footsteps behind us at any moment, feel hands grabbing our shoulders. After what felt like forever but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, we saw a building ahead, an old gas station, decrepit and barely standing. The pumps out front were ancient, the kind with the rolling numbers. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, but it was open. We practically fell through the door, gasping for breath. The inside was dimly lit and dusty. The shelves were maybe a quarter full, with old products covered in grime. Behind the counter sat a man, deeply tanned, almost leathery, wearing a grimy baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was reading a book with yellowed pages and a tattered cover. He looked up at us with a knowing expression that made my blood run cold. "You boys lost, huh?" he said, his voice gravelly. His smile revealed several rotten teeth. None of us had said anything yet. "Head back the way you came, make a left at the fork. Follow that road till you see a telephone pole. Then take a right down the trail. It'll take you to Highway 17. "Thank you," Marcus managed to say. The man's smile widened. "Best hurry. Gets dark fast out here." We left quickly, following his directions. As we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back. The man was standing in front of the gas station now, arms folded across his chest, watching us with that same rotten grin. He didn't wave, didn't move, just watched us walk away like he knew something we didn't. We found the telephone pole and took the trail, walking as fast as we could as the light faded from the sky. By the time we reached Highway 17, it was fully dark, and we were exhausted and terrified. We tried flagging down several cars, but no one stopped. Finally, a county sheriff's deputy pulled over, his lights flashing. "You boys all right?" he asked, looking concerned. We explained we were lost, gave him Marcus's address. The deputy whistled low. "You're about 40 miles from there. How'd you end up way out here?" During the 30-minute drive back to Marcus's house, the deputy made small talk. Eventually, he asked us where exactly we'd been. "We found an old church," Derek said, "and a gas station. Both off that dirt road near—" "You went into the woods out there?" The deputy interrupted, his voice suddenly serious. "Yeah, we got lost following the creek." The deputy was quiet for a moment. "Listen, I'm gonna give you boys some advice. Stay out of those woods. There are communities back in there that don't take kindly to outsiders. Old families, old ways. If you catch my drift." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. The deputy glanced at us in the rearview mirror. "Let's just say there's folks in these hills who practice things that ain't exactly Christian, if you know what I mean. Church isn't always church around here. Best to just forget you saw anything and don't go back." We didn't need to be told twice. Later that night, alone in Marcus's basement, we talked in whispers about what we'd experienced. We couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. All we knew was that we'd stumbled into something we weren't meant to see. Some gathering or ritual disguised as a church service, populated by people who weren't quite people anymore. I moved away for college a few months later and never visited Marcus in that town again. He moved back to our hometown the following year, and we never talked about that day. But sometimes, late at night, I still see those vacant faces in my dreams. 30 pairs of empty eyes, all turning to look at me in perfect synchronization, and the sound of wooden pews creaking in the silence. Story 2. The Ouija board we left behind. This happened 8 years ago when I was 19 and still living in New Jersey with my parents. My friends James and Sean and I were the kind of idiots who thought trespassing in abandoned buildings was the height of entertainment. We'd spend weekends exploring vacant houses, old factories, anywhere we weren't supposed to be. There was this abandoned church at the top of a hill about 2 miles from my house. The road leading up to it had been closed for years, blocked off with concrete barriers and warning signs. Local kids had been breaking into the place for decades, covering the walls with graffiti and leaving behind beer bottles and cigarette butts. The building had become a rite of passage. If you were brave enough to go inside at night, you had street cred. It was mid-October, and Sean came up with what he thought was a brilliant idea. We should bring a Ouija board to the church and try to contact spirits. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, grinning. "It's spooky season." James and I weren't particularly superstitious, but we agreed. Sean pulled an old Ouija board from his closet, the classic wooden kind with the Parker Brothers logo. And that Saturday night, we drove to the church. We parked on the side of the road near the barriers and walked up the hill using a single flashlight. The night was clear and cold, with a bright moon that cast everything in silver. When we reached the top, we turned on our other flashlights and approached the building. The church was a typical Gothic revival structure. Stone walls, pointed arch windows, a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side. The front doors hung open, one of them barely attached to its hinges. Graffiti covered every surface, pentagrams, crude drawings, declarations of love, band names, and more disturbing things I don't want to describe. We pushed the door open wider. It scraped horribly against the floor, and stepped inside. The interior was gutted. Pews had been smashed and scattered. Stained glass windows were shattered and debris covered everything. The altar at the far end was cracked and defaced. Our flashlights cut through the darkness as we swept them around, checking to make sure we were alone. "All clear," James said. We set up in the center of the nave, clearing a space on the floor. Sean placed the Ouija board down and pulled 3 candles from his backpack. "Dude, you brought candles?" I laughed. "Atmosphere, my friend," Sean said with a grin. "Gotta do this right." He arranged the candles in a triangle around the board and lit them. Then we turned off our flashlights. The change was immediate and unsettling. The candles provided just enough light to see the board and each other's faces. But beyond that, maybe 6 or 7 feet in any direction, there was nothing but impenetrable darkness. The graffiti-covered walls disappeared. The ceiling vanished. We could have been floating in a void. "Okay, this is actually creepy," James admitted. We placed our fingers on the planchette, and Sean started asking questions in a dramatic voice. "Is there anybody here with us? Any spirits who wish to communicate?" The planchette started moving almost immediately. We all laughed because it was obvious one of us was pushing it. It spelled out YES. "Oh, come on," I said. "Who's moving it?" "Not me," Sean and James said in unison, both grinning. We went along with it. Sean asked more questions and the planchette moved around, spelling out vague answers. We were joking and laughing, not taking any of it seriously. Then we heard the sound. It came from the direction of the altar. A sharp, loud crack that echoed through the church. It sounded exactly like a thick piece of wood snapping in half, but amplified, as if it had happened right next to us. We all jumped, and James immediately grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the altar. Nothing. The broken altar stood exactly as it had been, surrounded by debris. There was no one there, no movement. What the hell was that? I asked, my heart racing. "Old building," James said, but his voice was uncertain. "Probably just something settling." We tried to calm down, but the atmosphere had changed. We weren't laughing anymore. We went back to the Ouija board, but the planchette wouldn't move now. We asked questions, but nothing happened. I think we were all too freaked out to even pretend to move it. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes in tense silence, taking turns asking the board questions, when another sound came from the altar area. This time it was different, a scraping sound, like something being dragged across stone. Before we could react, before we could even turn our flashlights on, something hit the Ouija board with a heavy thunk. All 3 of us screamed and jumped back. On the board, right in the center, was a rock about the size of a golf ball. We all had our hands on the planchette 2 seconds before. There was no way any of us had thrown it. It had come from the darkness, from the direction of the altar, and landed right in the middle of the board. "Fuck this," James yelled. We didn't discuss it. We didn't investigate. We just ran. We left everything, the Ouija board, the candles still burning, and bolted for the door. We ran down that hill faster than I've ever run in my life, convinced something was chasing us. We didn't stop until we reached my car, and I drove away with tires squealing. We went to James's house and sat in his driveway for at least 30 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Our hands were shaking. We kept looking at each other in disbelief. "There's no way that was one of us," Sean said. "No way." "Someone else was in there," I said. "Had to be." But Sean shook his head. "We checked the whole place with our flashlights, and even if someone was hiding, they'd have to be able to see in complete darkness to hit the board like that. The candles barely gave off any light." James suggested that maybe someone had been hiding in the bell tower or some part of the church we hadn't checked, and they'd thrown the rock when we weren't looking. It was the only explanation that made sense, even though it terrified us to think someone had been watching us the whole time. Sean, who was deeply religious, had a different theory. "We contacted something," he said quietly. "Something that didn't want to be contacted." The next morning, Sean insisted on going back to get his Ouija board. He convinced James to go with him. They drove back to the church in broad daylight, walked up the hill, and entered through the same door we'd fled from. The candles were still there, burned down to stubs, but the Ouija board was gone. They searched the entire area, checked under debris, looked in corners, even went up to the altar where the sounds had come from. Nothing. The board had vanished. When Sean called to tell me, I felt sick to my stomach. Who takes a Ouija board but leaves 3 candles? And if someone had taken it during the night, that meant they'd been there after we left, or they'd been there the whole time, watching. The thought that someone or something had been in that church with us, hiding in the darkness beyond our candles, throwing rocks at us and waiting. It still gives me nightmares. That remains the single scariest experience of my life. We never went back to that church. I moved to Florida a few years later, and I still talk to Sean occasionally. Sometimes we bring up that night and he still insists we contacted something supernatural. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that something threw that rock with perfect accuracy in complete darkness, and then took our Ouija board but left everything else behind. Sometimes I wonder if whoever or whatever has that board is using it themselves, trying to contact something else. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're trying to contact us. Story 3: The Masked Congregation. My girlfriend Vanessa and I were house hunting in a rural area of northern Mississippi, looking for a place with enough land for her to keep her horses. Vanessa had been riding since she was a kid, and a big part of our decision to leave the city was so she could finally have her own barn. We spent a Wednesday afternoon driving around Warren County, checking out properties listed for sale. It was beautiful out there. Rolling hills, forests, the kind of peace and quiet we'd been craving. Most of the houses we saw were older and needed work, but we were handy and didn't mind a project. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were driving down a quiet 2-lane road when we passed a small church. It was a simple building, white painted wood with a small steeple sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. What caught our attention was the parking lot. It was full of cars. "There's a service going on," Vanessa said, touching my arm. "We should stop and check it out. See if it's a nice congregation." Vanessa was more religious than me. She went to Mass every week, and I tagged along most of the time to make her happy. If we were going to move to this area, she wanted to know there was a good church nearby. I pulled into the dirt parking lot, which was packed with vehicles. I noticed immediately that most of the cars were old, 80s and 90s models, some of them beat up and rusty. There was a red minivan that looked like it might not even run, an old Buick with a cracked windshield, a few pickup trucks with oxidized paint. "A lot of old cars," I said as we got out. "It's probably a lower income area," Vanessa replied. "Nothing wrong with that." I opened the church door for her and we stepped inside. The interior was small and simple. 5 rows of wooden pews on each side of a center aisle, all facing a modest altar at the front. The walls were bare except for a few windows. No decorations, no flowers, no bulletin boards. Just plain white walls and old wood. There had to be at least 25 people inside, all sitting in the pews with their heads bowed. It looked like they were in the middle of a prayer or moment of silence. We tried to be quiet as we slipped into the back row. That's when I started noticing things. First, everyone in the church appeared to be between 30 and 50 years old. In all my years of going to church with Vanessa, I'd never been to a service without elderly people. Churches always had seniors, usually lots of them. But here everyone looked middle-aged. Second, none of them were dressed nicely. Church clothes were usually the best you had. Dress shirts, slacks, dresses, nice shoes. But these people were wearing jeans and t-shirts, work clothes, some of them stained and wrinkled. A few wore baseball caps. The people in the pews closest to us started turning around to look at us. One by one, they twisted in their seats to stare. Then the people in front of them noticed and turned to look as well. It spread through the congregation like a wave, until every single person in the church had turned around to face us, and there was something wrong with their faces. They weren't just looking at us, they were glaring at us with open hostility. Their eyes were hard and cold, their mouths set in tight lines. It wasn't the uncomfortable glance you might get from arriving late to a service. This was pure, undisguised animosity. Vanessa and I exchanged nervous glances. I forced a smile and gave a small wave, trying to be friendly. No one smiled back. No one nodded. They just kept staring. That's when I realized they were all men. Every single person in that church was male. Not one woman, not one child, not one elderly person. Just 25 or 30 men between the ages of 30 and 50, all staring at us like we'd committed some unforgivable offense. Actually, no. They were staring at Vanessa. Their eyes tracked her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A figure stood up at the front of the church near the altar. He was wearing a mask, a simple black cloth mask that covered the lower half of his face. He raised his arm and pointed directly at us. "Who invited you here?" His voice was muffled by the mask but carried clearly through the silent church. The question caught me off guard. I stood up, instinctively putting myself slightly in front of Vanessa. "We were just driving by and saw that there was a service," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're thinking of moving to the area and we wanted to visit the local church." The masked man took a step toward us. "This is not your church. You need to leave now." My hands were shaking. This was all wrong. The man wasn't dressed like a priest, he wore jeans and a flannel shirt. There was no crucifix above the altar, no religious symbols anywhere. And that mask... "Come on, honey," I said to Vanessa, taking her hand. We backed toward the door and I could feel every pair of eyes burning into us. The men were all still turned in their seats, watching us retreat. Some of them had stood up, their bodies tense like they were ready to spring. We burst through the door and practically ran to our car. I fumbled with my keys, my heart pounding, and got us out of that parking lot as fast as I could. "What the hell was that?" Vanessa said, her voice shaking. She was looking in the passenger side mirror. "Babe, someone's coming out." I checked the rearview mirror. A man had exited the church and was walking to one of the vehicles. A gray van. "He's getting in his car," Vanessa said. "Google the Warren County Sheriff's Office," I told her. "Right now." She pulled out her phone and found the address. It was about 15 minutes away. I headed in that direction, keeping my speed reasonable, trying not to panic, but the gray van pulled out of the church parking lot behind us. "He's following us," Vanessa whispered. The van stayed behind us, not tailgating, but close enough that there was no doubt. It followed us through every turn, maintained the same distance. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. "What do they want?" Vanessa asked. She was gripping the door handle, her face pale. "I don't know, but we're not finding out." I followed the GPS directions to the Warren County Public Safety Building, a low brick structure with several patrol cars parked outside. The moment I pulled into the parking lot, the gray van drove past without slowing down and continued down the road. We sat there for several minutes, watching to make sure it didn't come back. When we were sure it was gone, I turned the car around and headed straight for the highway. We drove all the way home, over 2 hours without stopping, checking the mirrors constantly to make sure we weren't being followed. We never went back to Warren County. We never found out what that place was, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a church. I've thought about it a lot over the years, tried to make sense of it. The masks, the all-male congregation, the hostility, the fact that they followed us. Was it some kind of cult? A gang? Something worse? And the question that haunts me most: what were they doing in there? What kind of meeting requires everyone to wear work clothes and a mask, to be held in an abandoned-looking church in the middle of nowhere, in broad daylight with the doors unlocked? I don't want to know the answer. But sometimes I imagine what would have happened if we'd arrived 30 minutes earlier, or if we'd gone inside when no one else was there yet. Would we have found something we weren't supposed to see? Or would we have never been seen again? Story 4. The Man in the Hallway. I was 8 years old when this happened, and even though it's been over 15 years, I remember every detail with perfect, horrible clarity. I was a Cub Scout, and we held our weekly meetings at St. Michael's Catholic Elementary School, usually in the gym or one of the adjacent multi-purpose rooms. I liked Scouts well enough. We did crafts, played games, learned about camping and outdoor skills. It was a good time and I'd made some friends. But before I tell you about what happened at Scouts, I need to tell you about the Mass 2 weeks earlier. My mom, my younger brother Jake, and I went to church every other Sunday. We were usually late, which meant we ended up sitting in the back or standing near the doors if it was crowded. This particular Sunday, we managed to snag seats in the very last pew in the far back corner. About halfway through the service, I noticed an older man standing against the wall to my left. He had white hair, glasses, and a thick white mustache. He was looking at me. When I glanced over, he smiled and then made this weird face. He crossed his eyes and stuck out his tongue like he was trying to be funny or playful. But I was 8, not 3. It didn't seem funny. It seemed weird and uncomfortable. I looked away quickly, focusing on the priest, but I could feel the man still watching me. Every few seconds, I'd glance over and catch him staring. When our eyes met, he'd make another silly face, scrunching up his nose, waggling his eyebrows, pulling his ears. My mom noticed. She leaned over and whispered, "Ignore him, sweetie." She shot the man a sharp look. The next time I looked over, he was gone. I felt relieved until communion. As I walked back to my seat after receiving the Eucharist, I saw the man again. He was back in the same spot against the wall, and he was staring at me with that same creepy smile, watching me the entire walk back to my pew. My mom saw it too. As soon as I sat down, she took my hand and said quietly, "Let's go." We left early before the service ended. In the car, my mom said she didn't like the way that man had been looking at me. "Stay away from him if you ever see him again," she told me. I forgot about it over the next couple of weeks, until the Scout meeting. It was a typical Tuesday evening meeting. We'd done our opening ceremony, worked on a few projects, and now we were doing a scavenger hunt as our activity before closing. The Scout leaders had hidden items all around the school: the gym, cafeteria, adjacent hallways, some of the classrooms that were left unlocked. We were split into 2 teams and given a list of items to find: a flashlight, a first aid kit, a length of rope, a compass, a water bottle. The team that found the most items would win. I was running around the school with my list, checking rooms and hallways I'd never been in before. The place was huge and maze-like, especially the older sections. I wasn't having much luck finding anything on my list. Eventually, I found myself in a narrow hallway at the back of the cafeteria, near the kitchen. It was dimly lit and smelled like industrial cleaner. There was a standing freezer against one wall, the kind with a glass door that shows all the ice cream and popsicles inside. I checked the freezer, looking for any of the items on my list. Nothing but frozen treats, but I was hot from running around. and I figured no one would notice if I took one popsicle. I opened the freezer and grabbed a red, white, and blue rocket pop. Don't let them see you taking that. I jumped and spun around. The man from church was standing there, the old man with the white mustache and glasses. He was smiling that same smile, walking toward me slowly. "It's okay," he said, still approaching. "I won't tell." He reached out and closed the freezer door. My heart was pounding. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place. "You know," he said conversationally, "I have better treats than that in the back room. Really good stuff that the other kids aren't allowed to have. Would you like some?" He reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm but not quite painful. Yet, he started pulling me toward a door at the end of the hallway. A door marked staff only. "Come on," he said. "It'll just take a second." Something in my brain finally screamed at me to move. I yanked my hand back and tried to walk away. He grabbed my wrist this time much tighter. "Hey," he started. "Help," I yelled as loud as I could. He immediately let go and held up his hands. Shh, calm down. "I'm not—" "Help!" "Help," I ran. I sprinted back through the cafeteria, through the gym, screaming for help. I found our cub master, Mr. Peterson, near the supply closet. A man grabbed me. I was crying now, the fear and adrenaline overwhelming me. He tried to take me to a back room. Mr. Peterson's face went pale. He was a dad himself with kids in the scout troop, and he took it seriously immediately. He got the other leaders, made sure I was safe, and then went looking for the man. They found him in that hallway, standing there like nothing had happened. I watched from a distance as Mr. Peterson talked to him, his voice low and angry. The old man was shaking his head, gesturing, trying to explain something. But Mr. Peterson wasn't having it. He pulled out his phone and called someone. My mom showed up 20 minutes later, furious and terrified. I told her everything about the man from church, about him being in the school, about what happened in the hallway. "That's the same man?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. Mr. Peterson confirmed it. "I'm reporting him to the church administration right now," he told my mom. "This is unacceptable." Here's what we found out later. The man worked for the church. I'm not sure exactly what his job was. Maintenance maybe, or some kind of custodial position. But he lived on the church grounds in a small apartment, which explained why he'd been at Mass and why he had access to the school. Mr. Peterson and my mom filed official complaints with the church and the school. Within a week, something else came to light, something that made my stomach turn. Another family came forward. Their son had been an altar boy at St. Michael's for 2 years, and he finally told his parents what had been happening. The same man had been touching him inappropriately during altar service, when they were alone in the sacristy preparing for Mass. The boy had been too scared and confused to say anything, but when he heard about what happened to me, he found the courage to speak up. The church launched an investigation. I don't know all the details because my parents tried to shield me from most of it, but I overheard enough conversations to piece things together. There were other incidents, other complaints that had been quietly filed away or ignored. Patterns of behavior that should have raised red flags years ago. The man was fired and removed from church property. I heard he faced some kind of legal action, but I never found out if he went to prison. My parents moved us to a different parish after that, and I quit Cub Scouts. I couldn't go back to that school. Couldn't walk those hallways without seeing him standing there in that dim corridor, smiling his friendly smile while his hand gripped my wrist. What haunts me most isn't just what happened, it's what could have happened. What he was planning to do if I'd followed him through that door marked staff only. What was in that back room? How many other kids had he done this to? How many had he successfully lured away? And the worst thought of all, he'd been watching me for 2 weeks. From that first Mass when he made silly faces to get my attention, to showing up at my scout meeting in the exact hallway I happened to be in. That wasn't coincidence. He'd been planning it, waiting for his opportunity, using his position of trust in the church to access children. Sometimes I think about that altar boy who came forward after me. How brave he was to speak up about what had been done to him. I think about how many times he'd been alone with that man, how many times he'd been hurt, and I think about how close I came to being another victim. Another kid who'd been too scared or confused to tell anyone until it was too late. The church was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be sacred, but evil doesn't respect holy ground. Sometimes it hides behind a collar, behind a kind smile, behind someone the community trusts. It waits in dim hallways with promises of treats and special privileges, looking for children who are alone, who won't be missed for just a few minutes. I'm 23 now, and I still can't walk past a Catholic church without feeling that same grip on my wrist. I can't see an old man with a white mustache without my pulse quickening. And I can't stop wondering about that door he was pulling me toward, about what I would have found if I'd been just a little more trusting, a little more naive. Sometimes the real horror isn't ghosts or demons. Sometimes it's the monsters who look like people, who smile and wave and make funny faces, who work in churches and schools and places where children are supposed to be safe. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you escape. You scream for help and someone actually comes. The door stays closed and you never have to find out what was waiting on the other side. But the knowledge that it was there, that it's still out there somewhere, never really leaves you. Finally, these 4 stories share a common thread that should chill us all. Sacred spaces can be violated, corrupted, and twisted into something unrecognizable. Whether it's a remote congregation following practices we can't name, a force that dwells in abandoned holy places, a masked gathering with unknown purposes, or predators hiding behind the trust we place in religious institutions, evil finds ways to exploit the very places we seek sanctuary. The people who shared these experiences survived to tell their tales, but they're changed by them, forever looking at churches with a mixture of reverence and suspicion, forever wondering what happens behind closed doors, what gatherings take place in remote locations, what darkness might be lurking in hallways and back rooms. These aren't just stories about scary encounters. They're warnings about the importance of trusting your instincts, about recognizing when something is fundamentally wrong, even if you can't articulate why, about the courage it takes to run when every social instinct tells you to be polite and respectful in a place of worship. If you ever find yourself in a church that doesn't feel right, where the faces are wrong, where the symbols are missing, where someone's attention feels predatory rather than welcoming, trust that feeling. Leave. Run if you have to. Call for help, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are true, and sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones where we're taught we should feel safest. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember, not every building with a cross on top is serving the light.